So the last thing we need to look at is a little bit about the history of fad dieting and fad trends because it can come up when you discuss diets and nutrition with your patients and your clients. So let's talk about fad diets, and we'll look at the fad diets and the dieting issue as it relates to first the historical perspective, and then we'll get to modern day perspective. If we look at it historically, we start with the Greek and Roman perspective, where it wasn't necessarily about food consumption. It was more about the need to be active as it relates to body image and body morphology. There was some degree of what beautiful happened to be. And in the Greek and Roman perspective, the beautiful body was the body that was more active, where it had less body fat than fat free mass. So we would have a low percent body fat for the beautiful person. However, it was still what we would consider to be a normal perspective. And by normal perspective, I mean that society is going to deem what is beautiful. Where most of the physicians of antiquity, instead of prescribing a strict and regimented diet, would more often than not prescribe an activity for the persons to undertake so as to change body morphology. There were some herbs and quote unquote medicinal plants that would be used to help with the change of body morphology. This idea of beauty, this idea of what societal stance towards body morphology would deem acceptable, started to change as we moved into the medieval and Renaissanceal periods, even up into about the mid 1800s, where fat was an indication of someone being well off. And that's primarily because the rich had excessive amounts of nutrients. And because the rich had excessive amounts of nutrients, they were able to put on larger amounts of body mass than the people who were the peasants or the peons. And so the people who were toiling the in the fields wouldn't have enough nutrient positive balance so as to put on excessive amounts of body mass. However, the rich would, and it led to a host of diseases which we still deem quote unquote king diseases, KING diseases. And these include things like gout, where excessive amounts of meat consumption would lead to excessive amounts of urea, and excessive amounts of urea in circulation would lead to uric acid crystals being deposited within the synovial joints and get the onset of gout. Now, this fat being well off was not just a European stance. In fact, we see it amongst many of the tribal populations where the higher members of the tribe would start to put on excessive amounts of mass because they would have more food than the rest of the populace. And so they would start becoming larger, and he became more of a status of nobility within the tribes as opposed to what we would deem as quote unquote beautiful. Yet we still see the fat being beautiful if we were to look at most of the artistic renditions that were being portrayed at this point in time. And that has to do with the fact that most of the people being presented as the beautiful body were painted from people of noble stature because they had both leisure time as well as the money to pay the artists to paint them in renditions of goddesses and gods that would be then portrayed as this is what ideal happens to be. The shifting level of ideals in terms of what deems beautiful within the body is one of the principal issues that we look at when we start looking at the ideals of fad diets as we move into the 19th, 20th, and now 21st century. So we're going to move forward here and let's start looking at some more modern time. And we'll start with the 19th century. In the 19th century, we still have the idea that fat is for the well off. And that's because, once again, people who have money can have food, which means they have extra nutrients. And if they have extra nutrients, they'll be able to put on additional weight. But as we move through the century, through the 1800s, we start getting to these issues of what I eat is causing problems with my health, and the fact that we have too many overfat people for military actions. Remember, there's a whole bunch of wars that are going on at this point in time. What a lot of these eating issues develop is the concept we'll refer to as nutritional sanitariums. These are quote unquote hospitals to make you well based off of what you eat, and the quote unquote cure all supplements. Coming from these issues, we come with and start developing things that are still with us today. Things like breakfast cereals came about from these nutritional sanitarium movements. Things like bottled water came about from these nutritional sanitarium movements. Things like soda came about from this nutritional sanitarium movement and this cure-all movement. The other thing that started coming about during this time period is the logging and research of diet. And so the concept of fad diets is nothing new. Fad diets have been around since the late 1800s, with the first documented quote unquote fad diet being a journal published by an English gentleman known as William Banting that was referred to as Letter on Corpulence. And what it was his recording of what happened to his body when his doctor, his physician, put him on what would now be considered a low carbohydrate diet. Basically, he cut out breads and potatoes and other starches from his diet, and he ended up losing somewhere in the neighborhood of about 20 stones worth of weight over the course of the diet. There's other uh, attributes to diet that come from the medical journals, in which the medical journals start referencing diets as Banting. And the Banting that they're talking about here is from a Canadian physician. And the Canadian physician basically started to look at metabolic issues, in particular diabetes, and how diets go about in terms of regulating the person who is an insulin dependent diabetic and their level of carbohydrate load in regards to their disease onset. This concept of fad diets have continued, and it's now gone from fat being well off to fat being ugly. And this has led to the whole body positivity movement that has led to indication of the fact that we have a large proportionality of the populace that gears towards an anorexic lifestyle. And the reason for that is because we put onto magazine covers excessively androfied body images that have very low body fat. And because of that, we see fat as being ugly. The problem with the positive body image issue is that it can glorify people who have excessive fat depositing, which leads to other health issues. But it also changes back in terms of the societal reference as to what beauty actually is in regards to body morphology. Now, the problem with the fat being ugly is not just the anorexic issue, but it's the consumption of more cure-alls as it relates to the fat is ugly, and let's combat this ugliness by taking the pills that will mimic the increased necessity of physical activity that everybody pushes towards. Now, the other thing that's happened because of this fat is ugly is an explosion of various diets and cure-alls from diets based off of the fat being ugly issue, irregardless of or without regard to the issue of health status from the diets. And so, what are things that are going to be considered the fad diets? Well, this includes things like Atkins style, very low carbohydrate diet, the bland diet, the carbohydrate loading diet, the caveman diet, the clear liquid diet, the detox diet, the diabetic low glycemic, the full liquid diet, the low fat diet, the low potassium diet, the low sodium diet, the low residual fiber diet, the Mediterranean diet, the plant-rich diet, the vegan diet, the proportionality or Berry-Sears zone diet, and the raw food diet. Now, there's a whole bunch of diets out there, and the problem with the diet is that it becomes a dogmatic discussion amongst people. A lot of religious traditions come about through the use of foods within clan associations. In fact, a lot of the rules that you see within most of what we consider to be religions is dietary in nature. And when you start discussing diets with individuals, it becomes the same kind of dogmatic discussion that you have with people around religious and philosophical beliefs and orientations. However, if we were to look at the actual research and the good empirical research, there's a lot of research out there as it relates to diets. The problem is that most of them are not very good in terms of their research methodologies. However, of all of the diets that get pushed out there, the ones that have been shown in terms of meta-analytical support, that is where we've taken a whole bunch of studies that have looked at various metrics and compared results amongst and across studies, the ones that actually show empirical evidence are the low and very low carbohydrate diets, the low sodium diets, the proportionality diet, and the diabetic or low glycemic diet. Now, there's a lot of people say, well, what about the Mediterranean diets? The problem with the research on the Mediterranean diets is that they were looking at a very small subset of a single island population. And so there's a lot of genetic components that come in, just like I showed you with the issues of health status coming out from the body morphology. There's a lot of genetic components that come into health status as it relates to diet and metabolism that underpin some of the findings coming out of the Mediterranean diets in terms of the generalizations that we can have to the populace. In terms of performance benefit, there is benefit for the carbohydrate loading diet if done correctly for endurance athletes. The problem is that most people who try to do a carbohydrate loading diet do not do it correctly, and there's an actual scientific mechanism at play, and there's an actual procedure that has to take place in order to have the performance come about from the carbohydrate loading diet. So what's the take-home message that we can get to when we talk about diet and nutrition for our patients and our clients as it relates to metabolism is that it should never get to the point where we don't know what good food choices happen to look like. In this, we can use various tools at our disposals, and we usually use these at our disposals when working with our clinical nutritionists and our clinical dietitians. And we'll be doing this in lab for the nutrition lab, where we're going to be doing a 3-day dietary recall. The 3-day dietary recall is done when you actually consume. The closer you can record what you're eating to when you actually eat it, the less bias there is in terms of recall. When we do this, we look at when am I eating, what am I eating, and what other factors around the food consumption is coming into play as it relates to the meal itself. We do the 3 days on 2 typical weekdays and then 1 typical weekend, and that's because during the weekend, we usually have a change in our dietary patterns and our dietary habits relative to the weekdays, simply because there's more time for feeding on the weekends than there are during the weekdays. Now, this is going to change a little bit given the current conditions that we have at play in terms of spending more time at home. We're going to record not only what we eat, but when we ate it, and then what is the overall composition of what we are consuming. And what we need to make sure is that the diet that we're recording is not a change in what we normally would be consuming. And we have to do this on multiple occasions, particularly if we're looking at metabolic states for the person, where if we're going to test their metabolic state, we want to make sure that what we are having them eat the second time around is equivalent to what they ate the first time around, because diet and nutrient load will impact overall whole body metabolism.